today's stories, we follow 5 examples of what happens when people ignore safety rules at zoos. From a wealthy businessman who forced his way to hand-feed a tiger, to a drunkard who scaled a fence to pet kangaroos. But first we begin with a teen who leaned over a crocodile pool for the perfect photograph. It was June 21st, 2016, and the humid Florida afternoon hung heavy over a reptile zoo in Florida as families wandered between exhibits, children clutching ice cream cones that melted faster than they could eat them. The American crocodile pool shimmered under the relentless sun, its glass walls reflecting clouds while something ancient and patient waited just below the surface. Ethan Vittoria was a 17-year-old high school senior from Jacksonville with a social media account that documented his increasingly risky photography. He had spent the past year cultivating an aesthetic of danger, hanging from bridges, climbing water towers, and positioning himself at cliff edges for dramatic shots. His parents said that Ethan had been saving money from his part-time job at a hardware store to attend a photography workshop in Atlanta, hoping to turn his hobby into a career. That afternoon, he had driven to Gulfside with 2 friends specifically for the American crocodile exhibit, telling them he wanted shots that would stand out from typical photos. The crocodile enclosure featured a kidney-shaped pool approximately 40 feet long and 15 feet wide, bordered by a glass barrier that stood 5 feet high with an inward overhang. American crocodiles can reach lengths of over 13 feet and weigh up to 1,000 pounds, and their bite force is among the strongest of any living reptile. Unlike alligators, they are more aggressive and territorial. They are capable of explosive bursts of speed, both in water and on land. When attacking prey, crocodiles perform death rolls, violent rotational movements designed to tear flesh and disorient victims, though in shallow water these maneuvers are typically briefer, but no less devastating. 2 staff members had already approached groups of teenagers that afternoon, warning them about leaning over the glass. A maintenance worker had specifically called out to Ethan's group twice within 10 minutes, gesturing emphatically for them to step back. Ethan nodded with a smile, repositioning himself for a better angle. The water appeared calm, almost inviting in its stillness. A faint, oily sheen on the surface hinted at the 12-foot crocodile lurking below, barely visible as a dark shadow against the pool's painted bottom. Ethan's friends noticed him climbing onto the narrow ledge that remained wet from routine cleaning, his sneakers finding purchase on concrete still damp from the pool's filtration system. He extended his camera over the water, leaning forward at an angle that made several nearby visitors visibly uncomfortable. The fall happened suddenly. Ethan's left foot slipped on the wet ledge and his body pitched forward. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing his arms windmill in a futile attempt to regain balance before he tumbled headfirst into the pool. For perhaps 2 seconds there was confusion. Adults froze, children pointed, and Ethan surfaced briefly, sputtering. Then the crocodile surged upward from below, its massive jaws clamping onto Ethan's torso just below his ribcage. The reptile immediately twisted and pulled, initiating a death roll. Ethan's body spun violently, his limbs flailing uselessly as the animal dragged him sideways through the pool. Witnesses described the sound as horrific, a combination of thrashing water, the boy's screams cut short, and the deep, guttural hissing of the crocodile. The water darkened rapidly with spreading blood. Each rotation of the death roll drove the crocodile's teeth deeper, crushing bone and tearing flesh. The reptile dragged him under completely, and for several seconds only turbulent water was visible. He surfaced once more, his face pale and contorted, before being pulled down again. People screamed and pounded on the glass barriers. A handler sprinted toward the emergency equipment station, while other staff members attempted to distract the crocodile with noise and movement. The animal remained submerged with the victim, and staff were unable to intervene while it maintained its hold. Ethan's friend dialed 911. Police and paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, but the situation required specialized response. After several minutes, the crocodile released and moved away from the center of the pool, allowing the park's ranger team, equipped with protective gear and safety lines, to enter the water and recover Ethan's body. The medical examiner's preliminary report noted massive trauma to the torso, with multiple rib fractures, a crushed sternum, severe lacerations, and significant blood loss. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of drowning and traumatic injury. The zoo closed the exhibit immediately and faced intense scrutiny from state wildlife officials. The crocodile was not euthanized, as officials determined it had acted according to natural predatory instinct within its own enclosure. Ethan's friends left the zoo in silence, visibly shaken but physically unharmed. They gave statements to police and zoo officials and returned home, avoiding discussions about the incident for several days. Both took time off school, quietly processing what had happened, and did not return to the crocodile exhibit for the rest of the season. Even as Ethan's camera floated in the bloodied water, as an example of dumb confidence. In India, a wealthy businessman's arrogance would lead him to thrust his arm through a tiger cage's feeding slot. It was October 9th, 2015, and the late morning sun beat down on the concrete walkways of a zoo in Karnataka, India. Within hours, the scheduled tiger feeding would become a spectacle of a very different kind. Devansh Malhotra was a 46-year-old real estate developer from Bangalore, known throughout the city's business circles for his aggressive negotiation tactics and his belief that money could open any door. His colleagues described him as someone who treated rules as suggestions meant for others, not for men of his standing. He had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd investments and an uncanny ability to leverage connections, often reminding subordinates that he knew people in positions of power who could make problems or people disappear. That morning, Devansh arrived at the zoo with his extended family for his nephew's birthday. Dressed in designer clothing, he had already complained about the facilities. When he heard about the 11:30 a.m. tiger feeding, he decided it would be the highlight. But watching from behind barriers wasn't enough. He wanted to feed the tiger himself, likely to impress his family. Bengal tigers represent one of nature's most efficient killing machines, with adult males weighing between 400 and 570 pounds of pure muscle and predatory instinct. These apex predators can accelerate to speeds of 35 miles per hour in short bursts and possess a bite force powerful enough to crush bone and sever limbs in a single snap. A junior zookeeper assigned to the feeding demonstration had already refused Devansh's initial request 3 times, explaining that only trained personnel could approach the feeding slot. Other staff members reinforced this message, pointing to the warning signs and explaining that the protocol existed to protect visitors. Devansh responded with rising anger, berating the zookeeper and threatening his job, loudly claiming municipal connections during phone calls. When refused again, he accused the young keeper of discrimination. After 15 minutes of pressure, the keeper extended the staff feeding portion on a wooden stick, but Devansh pushed his hand past the sill instead. Inside, the 9-year-old male tiger, Sultan, paced with visible agitation, ears slightly flattened and tail twitching. As Devansh crouched and pushed the chicken toward the feeding slot, Sultan's body tensed. The attack happened with shocking speed. Sultan exploded forward, closing the 6 feet to the feeding opening in a heartbeat. His massive jaws clamped down on Devansh's extended forearm. Multiple witnesses, including Devansh's family members standing just 20 feet away, watched in frozen horror as the tiger's teeth penetrated completely through flesh and bone, the animal's powerful neck muscles jerking backward. Devansh's scream cut through the air as Sultan began trying to drag him forward and pull his arm into the feeding slot. The concrete around the feeding slot became slick with blood as Sultan shook his head violently from side to side, the way tigers naturally tear chunks from larger prey. Devansh's shoulder slammed against the iron grating repeatedly, his free hand clawing desperately at the concrete as he was pulled with terrifying force. The tiger's front claws extended through the grating, raking across Devansh's chest and face, opening deep parallel gashes. Each shake of Sultan's head sent blood spraying in wide arcs across the viewing platform. Devansh's screams had devolved into wet, gurgling sounds as blood filled his throat. His body went into shock within 90 seconds of the initial bite, though Sultan continued pulling and tearing for another minute. The zookeepers immediately initiated emergency protocols, rushing to the rear access door with fire extinguishers and air horns. They discharged the extinguishers through the bars while creating as much noise as possible, causing Sultan to momentarily release his grip. In that brief window, they threw several pounds of fresh meat into the far corner of the enclosure. Sultan, his muzzle dark with blood, hesitated for 3 seconds before moving toward the distraction. The keepers quickly secured him in the rear holding pen while cordoning off the viewing platform. Emergency services, called by zoo security within 30 seconds, found Devonsh face down at the base of the enclosure wall in a spreading pool of blood. His right arm was completely severed just below the shoulder, lying several feet away, and deep lacerations covered his chest, neck, and face. He had no pulse and was not breathing. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as catastrophic blood loss from traumatic amputation and multiple penetrating injuries. He likely lost consciousness within 2 minutes from hypovolemic shock, with death occurring within 4 minutes. Damage to the brachial, subclavian, and carotid arteries caused blood loss estimated at over 40% of total volume. The zoo immediately suspended all feeding demonstrations and closed the big cat section for review. An investigation revealed that the junior zookeeper had been pressured into allowing the incident, and while no disciplinary action was taken, he resigned 2 weeks later, citing trauma. As the feeding slot in Karnataka bore witness to the arrogance that caused a deadly mauling, in southern Russia, a stubborn factory worker would step over reinforced railings, bringing himself within striking distance 600-pound brown bear. It was August 14, 2016, at the A Zoo in southern Russia. Among the visitors that day was Mikhail Kuznetsov, 42, a factory foreman, his 7-year-old son Dima at his side. Mikhail was known among his co-workers at the Krasnodar metalworking plant as a man who never backed down from anything. Standing just under 6 feet tall, with a solid build from years of manual labor, he had a reputation for stubbornness that bordered on defiance. His wife Marina often joked that once Mikhail set his mind to something, an army couldn't change it. He collected small mementos from every family outing, ticket stubs, photos, souvenirs, filling boxes in their apartment with what he called the family archive. That day, he wore his favorite cap, a gift from Dima for Father's Day, embroidered with a small bear logo. When a gust of wind caught it and sent it tumbling towards the bear enclosure during their visit, Mikhail's determination to retrieve it overrode every rational thought. The bear exhibit sprawled across nearly an acre, designed with natural rock formations, a small pond, and vegetation meant to simulate the Caucasus Mountains. A narrow maintenance walkway, about 6 feet wide, ran along the outside of the inner moat, separated from the bare island by a low secondary fence, and the public viewing railing stood 4 feet above the walkway. What Mikhail likely didn't fully appreciate was the raw power of the animal before him. Eurasian brown bears can weigh up to 1,200 pounds, with males typically ranging between 550 and 660 pounds of muscle and predatory instinct. The bear in the exhibit, a male named Boris, weighed approximately 600 pounds and had been rescued from a private collector 3 years earlier after displaying aggressive behavior. The perimeter fence stood only 4 feet high, topped with an angled barrier designed to discourage climbing, but not prevent it entirely. A design flaw that had been noted in safety reports, but never addressed. Signs in Russian and English warned visitors to maintain distance, with red pictograms showing a bear attacking a human figure. Zoo staff patrolled regularly, and the exhibit was positioned to allow visibility from multiple angles. When Mikhail's cap landed just beyond the outer railing, about 8 feet from the inner fence and roughly 20 feet from Boris, several nearby visitors immediately stepped back. A mother pulled her children away. An elderly man pointed at the warning signs and shook his head disapprovingly. Mikhail approached the railing, leaned over, and assessed the distance. His son tugged at his sleeve, clearly frightened, but Mikhail waved him off. A zoo attendant stationed near the primate exhibit spotted the situation and began walking quickly towards them, calling out in Russian for Mikhail to step back. Other visitors joined in, some gesturing frantically. Boris had lifted his massive head, his small eyes now fixed on the movement at the edge of the inner fence. The bear rose to all fours and began a slow, deliberate walk towards the outer fence. Within seconds, Mikhail had swung one leg over the railing, then the other. He dropped the 3 feet to the 6-foot-wide maintenance walkway between the outer public railing and the inner moat fence. The cap lay within arm's reach if he stretched. The zoo attendant was now running, shouting continuously. Boris had accelerated from a walk to a purposeful trot, covering the 20 feet between himself and the walkway in a few seconds. Mikhail stretched forward, his fingers brushing the cap's brim. Boris struck with the explosive force of a freight train. The bear reared onto his hind legs and brought both front paws down on Mikhail's extended arm as it reached toward the inner fence. The sound of bone breaking was audible to witnesses 20 feet away. A wet crack followed by Mikhail's screaming. Boris's claws, each measuring over 3 inches long, shredded through fabric and flesh. The bear's jaws clamped onto Mikhail's forearm just below the elbow, and he began thrashing violently, using his mass to wrench and crush. Mikhail's body slammed repeatedly against the inner fence as Boris pulled, trying to hook his claws into clothing or flesh. Several staff members arrived with deafening air horns, bear spray, and a fire extinguisher. The combination caused Boris to flinch and retreat a few steps, shaking his head and snorting. This moment allowed staff to pull Mikhail to safety along the maintenance walkway, preventing further immediate contact. Mikhail's breathing was shallow and rapid, signs of hypovolemic shock. His right arm was partially degloved, chest wounds exposed ribs, and one punctured a lung. His son Dima watched from behind a bench. Emergency responders arrived 6 minutes after the call. About 12 minutes into transport, he went into cardiac arrest and could not be resuscitated. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as exsanguination from traumatic mauling. The zoo faced intense scrutiny following Mikhail's death. Authorities closed the facility for 3 weeks while safety modifications were implemented. Marina filed a lawsuit against the zoo for inadequate safety measures, eventually receiving a settlement. A father's determination had cost him his life and his family's future. Meanwhile, in Kenya, a student leaned over a hippo pool with bread in hand, unaware that the placid-looking creatures below possessed jaws powerful enough to shatter bone in a single snap. It was March 3rd, 2017, at a modest zoo on the outskirts of Kenya's capital, where the boundaries between visitors and animals had always been uncomfortably thin. Juma Odhiambo was 16 years old, a student at a secondary school known more for his daring stunts than his academic performance. Teachers had disciplined him multiple times for dangerous behavior, but his classmates said that Juma seemed to interpret every warning as a challenge rather than genuine concern. His presence at the zoo that Saturday was part of a church youth group outing, though he had spent most of the morning separated from the adult chaperones, roaming the grounds with 3 friends who both encouraged his antics. That morning, Juma announced he would hand-feed the hippos, ignoring staff warnings and signage. His friends watched, expecting a stunt. He bought a bag of bread from a vendor, disregarding the woman's comment that it was meant for the birds, not the larger animals. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous creatures in Africa, responsible for an estimated 500 human deaths annually. Despite their appearance, they are highly territorial and aggressive, capable of charging at speeds up to approximately 20 miles per hour on short bursts. Their massive jaws can open very wide and deliver a bite force enough to severely crush a human limb. At approximately 1:15 p.m., Juma climbed over the low barrier while his friends filmed. A zoo guide spotted the breach immediately and shouted for Juma to step back. The command was loud enough that several nearby visitors turned to look. Juma ignored him completely, edging closer to where 2 adult hippos wallowed in the shallow end of the pool. One of his friends called out that he was being stupid, but the comment was delivered with laughter rather than genuine alarm. Juma crouched at the pool's edge, just 3 feet from the water, and extended his hand holding chunks of bread. The larger of the 2 hippos, a 7-year-old male named Biko, lifted his head from the water. For several seconds, the animal remained motionless, likely assessing an intruder in his territory. The guide was running toward the enclosure now, waving his arms and blowing a whistle attached to his uniform. Other staff members were alerted by the commotion. Juma leaned forward, dangling the bread closer to Biko's snout, apparently interpreting the hippo's stillness as docility rather than the territorial display it actually represented. The attack happened with shocking speed for such a massive animal. Biko surged forward, water cascading off his bulk as his jaws opened wide. The sound of his teeth snapping shut on Juma's right leg was audible to witnesses 15 feet away. A wet crunch that one visitor later described as similar to someone snapping a thick branch. Juma's scream was immediate and high-pitched as the hippo's tusks punctured through his calf muscle and fractured both the tibia and fibula. He tried to pull back, but Biko's grip was absolute. The hippo yanked downward with tremendous force, dragging Juma off the concrete edge and into the pool. His upper body hit the water first, arms flailing as he tried desperately to grab something solid. The water, previously calm, erupted into violent chaos. Biko began thrashing side to side, a natural behavior hippos use to tear chunks of vegetation, but applied now to human flesh. Juma's free leg kicked frantically, breaking the surface before disappearing again. Blood began spreading through the water in dark clouds. Zoo staff reached the enclosure within 30 seconds of the initial attack. The guide grabbed an air horn from an emergency station and began blasting it repeatedly at intervals, the deafening sound designed to disorient and frighten the animals. 2 other staff members arrived with long handling poles used from behind the secondary barrier, striking the water's surface and shouting. The only holding gate keys were stored in the staff office across the park, and bystanders blocked immediate access, delaying full intervention. For 8 minutes, Biko dragged Juma deeper into the pool, surfacing periodically with his jaws still clamped on the mangled leg. The second hippo had retreated. Staff drove Biko toward the back holding area with noise and hoses, reaching Juma, by then unresponsive, at 1:27 p.m. His right leg was nearly severed below the knee, held by tissue and shattered bone, with deep puncture wounds across thigh and torso. Emergency services, called by a friend, arrived within 12 minutes. Paramedics found Juma unresponsive with no pulse and transported him to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 2:03 p.m. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as massive trauma and hemorrhagic shock from multiple crushing injuries, with drowning and massive hemorrhage contributing. The zoo faced immediate investigation from Kenyan authorities. Biko was relocated to a more secure facility rather than being destroyed, as officials determined the animal had acted defensively within his territory. Juma's family held a private burial ceremony 3 days later at their family plot in Kisumu. However, even as Juma's family warned others about the explosive violence lurking in Kenya's hippo pools in Australia, a laborer would scale a fence toward creatures most dismiss as harmless. It was July 12, 2018, and the winter sun cast pale light over the kangaroo paddock at a zoo in Adelaide. Within hours, that quiet winter day would be marked by screams alongside Blake Giraldo's impulsive decision. Blake was a 29-year-old laborer from Elizabeth, a working-class suburb north of Adelaide. He worked irregular shifts at a construction supply warehouse, a job that suited his unpredictable nature but frustrated his supervisors. Co-workers described him as likable when sober, but reckless after drinking, prone to dares and stunts that had already resulted in 2 minor arrests for public disturbance. That Thursday afternoon, Blake had been drinking since late morning with 2 friends at a pub near the zoo. Security footage showed them arriving around 1:30 p.m., Blake unsteady and slurring as he joked with the ticket clerk. His friends later said the zoo visit had been a joke, not expecting him to go through with it. Once inside, he headed straight for the kangaroo paddock, saying he wanted to pet one despite their weak protests. Red kangaroos are the largest marsupials on Earth, with adult males standing over 6 feet tall and weighing up to 200 pounds of pure muscle. Their hind legs contain the most powerful muscles in the animal kingdom relative to body size. These legs, evolved for covering vast distances across the Australian outback, can inflict deep lacerations and severe blunt trauma with a single strike. A single volunteer, stretched thin due to limited staffing, saw Blake approaching an older section of fencing with loosened mesh near a support post. She called out for him to step back. Blake grinned, saluted, then gripped the fence to test it. His friends shouted as he found a foothold and began climbing clumsily. Inside, a large male kangaroo, later identified as Rex, stopped grazing and turned toward the noise. The volunteer ran for the nearest emergency phone as Blake swung over the fence and dropped onto the grass. Blake landed hard, stumbling before regaining balance, laughing and calling to the kangaroos. Most hopped away, but Rex stayed, lowering his head and flattening his ears. Blake moved closer, unsteady, crossing the 30 feet between them. Rex began a behavior known as pawing, scratching at the ground with his powerful hind legs while balancing on his thick tail. This display, common in aggressive males, serves as a final warning before attack. Blake either didn't notice or didn't care, swaying as he approached to within 10 feet of the animal. Several witnesses later described the exact moment Rex's posture changed, his body tensing as Blake stumbled forward with an outstretched hand. The kangaroo exploded into motion with shocking speed, closing the distance in 2 bounds. He reared back on his massive tail, his body forming a tripod, and his hind legs shot forward in a double kick that caught Blake squarely in the chest. The impact sounded like a baseball bat striking a side of beef, a wet, hollow thud that carried across the paddock. Blake flew backward, his feet leaving the ground as he crashed onto his back 3 feet away. He rolled onto his side, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to draw breath. The kick had fractured his sternum and several ribs, causing severe pulmonary contusion and internal bleeding. Before Blake could attempt to rise, Rex advanced again, raking Blake's arms and upper torso with claw-driven forearm swipes. Blake managed to raise his arms defensively, but Rex's next kick caught him in the abdomen with even greater force than the first. The blow caused significant abdominal trauma and likely splenic injury, leading to rapid internal hemorrhaging. He curled into a fetal position, his body convulsing as blood began pooling in his abdominal cavity. The entire attack lasted less than 40 seconds from first contact to Rex's withdrawal. The kangaroo, satisfied the threat had been neutralized, hopped several yards away and resumed his defensive stance, watching as Blake lay motionless in the grass. Zoo staff arrived within 90 seconds with poles and nets, waiting until Rex was behind a barrier before entering. 2 keepers created a barrier, while a third reached Blake, who was conscious but unresponsive, breathing shallow and rapid from internal bleeding. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, entering only after Rex was secured. Despite fluid resuscitation and rapid transport, Blake suffered cardiac arrest in the ambulance. Emergency physicians performed a thoracotomy, but found extensive blunt force injuries and uncontrolled internal bleeding. He was pronounced dead at 3:47 p.m. Rex remained at the facility, with zoo officials emphasizing the animal had acted purely in self-defense. Blake's family, while devastated, acknowledged his history of poor judgment and declined to pursue legal action against the zoo, instead requesting privacy during their grief. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here.